So I'm making it a habit of trying to smash 50-year-old idols in political science, so this is just continuing that trend. So today I'm going to criticize the concept of rational ignorance, which is a necessity argument, that voters are necessarily ignorant. And I'm going to claim that it's an empirical question and suggest that although the empirics are unknown, that it's likely that voters are not that much more ignorant than consumers, or are about as well informed as consumers. So I'm going to mention it's. I got it. Who's going to? Aileen, is she here? Okay. I'm going to just talk about how these views originated in Schumpeter and were made stronger by Downes' linkage of voter ignorance to the paradox of non-voting. I'm then going to give my challenge to the paradox of non-voting, which is the idea that it's irrational, instrumentally irrational for any one person to vote. I'm going to present an empirical challenge to rational ignorance, and then, depending on time, talk about Brennan's expressive voting, which is related to these same questions, and Kaplan's rational irrationality, which is also related to these questions, because the crucial question here is similar to Brian's challenge. There can be no collective wisdom in democratic politics if voters are ignorant, especially if they're necessarily ignorant, and we're almost certain of this fact, because the aggregation of nonsense would be nonsense. So to give you some background, the Freakonomics guy, Levitt, says an economist would be embarrassed to be seen at the voting booth. And although most citizens vote, the standard view in rational choice theory is that it's irrational to do so, because it's extremely likely that any one vote would break a tie, and when a single vote does break a tie, when a single vote does not break a tie, it has no causal force on the outcome. And since voting is costly, almost any single vote would be instrumentally irrational. And if it's irrational to vote, it's at least as irrational to know anything about the candidate or the issue voted upon. To quote Professor Kaplan, economists have long argued that voter ignorance is a predictable response to the fact that one vote doesn't matter. Why study the issues if you can't change the outcome? Why control your knee-jerk emotional ideological reactions if you can't change the outcome? And although most citizens do have some political knowledge, the standard view in rational choice theory is that voters are rationally ignorant. This originates in Schumpeter, who I won't go into his history, but he spritzed up, it's tempting, but he spritzed up with economics, Le Bon's wilted theory of the crowd, and transplanted it to American soil. And the alteration he made was he gave it an economic twist. He said that the individual will is more definite with respect to consumer choices because consumers directly experience the consequences of their choices, but is indefinite with respect to democratic choice because voters do not directly experience the consequences of their choices. Then, that was around 1943, and then in the early 1950s, the era of political plasticity under Eisenhower, survey research by political scientists associated with the University of Michigan found that citizens are variably informed and that many know little about the less obvious facts of politics. And then, so there's an empirical fact, and then in 1957, Downes, in his famous economic theory of democracy, gave a paradox of voting interpretation to the empirical fact of poor voter information. And it takes this form, and that an individual would vote if and only if the probability of being decisive in the vote times the value of the benefit minus the cost of voting is greater than zero. Well, the probability of being pivotal and causing an election outcome is approximately 0. 0 times any benefit, no matter how large, is 0. And since it's disingenuous to deny that there's a cost to voting, then no one would be instrumentally motivated to vote. And then there are various ad hoc fixes, like saying, well, voters feel a duty to vote. So elsewhere in greater detail in response to the... and if no one has an incentive to cast a vote, no one has an incentive to gather information, which is even more costly than voting. So elsewhere in more detail, I developed what I call a contributory theory of voting, and its content can be almost entirely summarized with a simple example. Suppose reasonably that one likes playing basketball for the sake of winning, for the sake of winning by the largest margin, and for the sake of losing by the smallest margin. The paradox of non-voting, however, insists that only winning counts, and that it would be irrational to play on the team if it might lose or if it might win by more than one point. And if it's irrational to play on the team, it's even more irrational to learn anything about the game. So the model would predict rational ignorance about abstention from any team sport and ignorance of its content. And past responses to the paradox of non-voting have made what I say are ad hoc fixes that, to continue the analogy, who cares about the score? We just want to play the game. Or it's one's non-consequentialist duty to play the game, which clearly isn't the case with baseball. Or one expresses oneself by playing the game. Or the one I had, you're paid to play the game. So when I gave this a presentation at a very rational choice audience, a student said, a non-American student said, well, I know why everyone votes. Why is that? Well, they get given a bottle of whiskey, and that gets a vote. And I said, you have more history to learn than you know at the moment. There are two steps to my challenge to the paradox of non-voting. One is, what does the voter value? Not his or her self-interest. And Professor Kaplan would agree with me, I think. Maybe he doesn't, but the evidence, the weight of the evidence with qualifications is that citizens value the public interest at least as much as they do their private interest in the act of voting. And thus I claim that a person would be rationally motivated to vote if she believed that she was contributing to the achievement of a great public good or avoidance of a great public bad. And, of course, I won't go through the details of those various citations. And before I continue with the second point, I want to mention that this model predicts that no one would vote, or almost no one would vote, but in the democracies, voter turnout is stable and high, ranging per decade since the end of World War II. All democracies, not just the developed ones, 61 to 68% of the voting population. And the U.S. is an outlier at 48%. So the first part of my argument is voters vote for a great public good. The second has to do with how citizens value the vote. So the claim that voting is irrational often confounds two logically independent claims, redundancy and imperceptibility. So the first claim is redundancy. The usual view is that this is my utility over the act of voting given other people's actions. that if I'm a minority voter, I value my action not at all. If I'm in the range of one vote greater than a majority, I don't value that increment. The only motivation is if I'm the pivotal voter. So call this the winning value of voting. Oh, it should be at 0.
The upper line should be there. The upper line should be there, Gerry?
Yeah, you might be right. That was just tugging at my unconscious. You may be right. I may have to revise that.
Why shouldn't it be there? Well,
let's not get too complex.
If I know that 51% to the vote in any case, then the value of my vote falls back to 0. Yes.
Good point. Let me think on it overnight. Well, I'm going to... this is a problem of overdetermined causation, and I could talk about it, but it's not essential to my argument in a 30-minute time frame, so I'm going to skip that. Now, some voters may not care about... okay. So then, the redundant... so there's not only the redundancy. I claim to defeat the redundancy, or that the redundancy argument is not relevant. And the second argument is the imperceptibility argument. That I'm sorry. I have to get. I'm out of order. There are some kind of voters. Let's say that it's possible anyway. It's logically possible. There's some kind of voters who don't care about the winning value of their vote at all, but only the mandate value. That they want to add to the majority. They want to add to. They want to have the biggest possible majority. Not an empirical claim, just a claim of logical possibility. And then, if you value both winning and you value mandate, then you get the top curve there. Yes, you value winning a lot, but if you're in the minority, you want your minority to advance. And if your vote is redundant in that it pushes that it's over the required majority for the winning of the election, you still might value it for the reasons that you want to advance a great public good. And let me give you some more concrete examples. So in a majority rule election, it's possible that a minority voter would be happy with a larger minority. I know I've done that many times myself, because I'm usually in the minority. And a majority voter would be happy with a larger majority, each for outcome-related reasons. And my colleague James Fowler reminds us that politicians, we're committing a bit of an analytic fallacy here. We don't care about just a single election. We care about all elections. So Fowler says, politicians and voters care about electoral and policy results over a sequence of elections, not just one. And if that's so, then winners may shift, candidate winners and party winners may shift to more preferred policies after a large margin of victory. So there are outcome-related reasons for wanting to have more than the bare majority. Because of less resistance by the opposition and less fear about the next election. And also a large margin provides new information about the location of the median voter, which affects positions offered by parties in the next election. So that's my response to the redundancy argument. Now we come to the imperceptibility argument, that voting is irrational because the influence of one person's vote is imperceptible. And here I just argue arguments from Derek Parfit, that just because I do an imperceptible harm doesn't mean that I haven't done harm. And just because I've done an imperceptible benefit does not mean I have not done a benefit. I can cash that out with an example in questions if that's unclear. Because imperceptible harms accumulate. So if I take the catalytic converter out of my car so that my car is creating more pollution, I'm adding to the city's pollution in an imperceptible way, but it's still a harm even though it's a small harm, because the addition of many small harms turns into a noticeable harm. So then the objection I most frequently heard here is that, well, a small contribution to a large public good, a small contribution that's imperceptible, means that there's not enough vividness to motivate voting. Then imperceptible contribution is not vivid enough to motivate voting. And my answer to that is, well, many people vote. And secondly, that this vividness objection appeals to irrational considerations, not to rational ones. Because if something mildly important is a small part of a big thing, that does not make it unimportant. And that, moreover, voting in an election is more vivid than many other public goods obtained from many small contributions. And I have some accounts of the robustness of small contributions to large public goods from Pelican and van der Veen in Dutch environmental public goods, and Bruno Frey's study of voluntary contributions to student relief funds in Swiss University. Next, voters talk, when you interview them systematically, voters talk like they're motivated by the contributory model, not by the pivotalist model. They say that they're motivated by duty and by wanting to influence the outcome. Now, we don't know much about the content of this duty claim because no one's thought to ask about the details. People, investigators who are puzzled by the conflict between the paradox of non-voting and high voter turnout, love this duty finding and they run to it. But they don't ask what kind of duty. They assume that it's a non-consequentialist duty. But we don't know because no one's ever been asked whether it's a duty for its own sake or a duty for the sake of its consequences. So we don't know. I surmise that it's both. A duty for the typical voter, it's a duty for its own sake and duty for the sake of its consequences. But that's only my hunch. And hopefully we'll find out more. I don't need the slides anymore. So Downs, as I said before, premised rational ignorance directly upon the paradox of non-voting. So you had the combination of robust empirical finding with prestigious theory bolstering this view. Next step of the argument. Economists sometimes assume that economic agents are perfectly informed, or at least they're well informed, and that consumers are perfectly informed, and that because of the paradox of non-voting, that voters are perfectly ignorant. Well, it's obvious which institution wins the contest in that case. The market wins. Wins the comparative institutional race. But given this argument, one starts to ask, well, there's a theoretical prediction that voters would know less than consumers, but what is it that consumers know? And we looked and we could find very little that was useful. So Matt McCubbins and I did a pilot study where we, as a just to see whether we should do a larger study, and we asked student respondents in a systematic way their knowledge of issues of concerns to voters and issues of concerns to consumers. And it turns out that large majorities know about national political issues, and few, including me, know much about important, very important, but obscure state of California issues. I should even know because it affects my job, but I've got other things to do in life. As to consumer issues, people don't know which sports activities are more likely to cause injury. They don't know the content of toothpaste. They don't know the market cost of health insurance. They don't know which common foods have greater or fewer calories. They don't know which common grocery items like apples and oranges cost more or less. They don't know that acetaminophen is the major cause of liver failure, and it kills how many thousands of people every year. They don't know that you're more likely to die in your home in a fall than in a fire. These are sort of arbitrary questions that a better study would have to more systematically choose questions of comparability between voting and markets. I was talking about with Brian, that's very difficult. They do know some details about their most beloved consumer items like iPods, but voters and consumers each showed a wide range of knowledge and ignorance on factual questions in each realm. Good, 8 minutes, okay. And then so a response may be to concede that consumers are rationally ignorant about trivial purchases, but become fully informed when the stakes are high. So I look at a Federal Trade Commission study of 819 recent mortgage customers. It asks them to examine and compare hypothetical loan documents, and the results are dismal. Just to give, half could not correctly identify the loan amount on a $200,000, $300,000 transaction. And then, although I'm quoting selectively about political knowledge, I show that voters have, just for example, 91% can find Texas on a map, 76% can find the Soviet Union, 63% in 1983 could find Grenada, 81% know who Andrew Jackson was, 74% know who gave the Statue of Liberty to the United States. And 58% know who Napoleon Bonaparte is. More Americans know who Napoleon Bonaparte is than can figure out the cost of a loan from a loan contract. This is a bit, yes, this comparison can be attacked as a bit unfair. It's very quick. It's preparation for further work. Now the public choice school of thought, which I respect in many ways, has built on the rational ignorance idea. Jeffrey Brennan, my friend, and his colleague Warren Lemosky have developed an expressive theory of voting that if there's no instrumental value to voting, then there is people's valuation of it is they wish to. It's a desire to express a desire, and because it's expressive, it can be subject to the frailties of whimsicality and malice, and thus puts democratic choice into doubt compared with market choice. And then Brian Kaplan, I say, being more true to Schumpeter than Downs, says that voters are not only rationally ignorant, worse, they're rationally irrational. And I'm sorry I don't have the time to go through the details of my argument, which were a bit last minute. But again, you can see that if Brian's theoretical account of voter ignorance, not his empirical arguments, but his theoretical account of voter ignorance and irrationality, depends on what I call the pivotal model of voting. And if the contributory model were true, or if it were more accurate, then that aspect of his argument would be called into doubt. How am I on time? the basic contrast here, I think the more basic contrast here is between individual action and collective action of any kind. And if the pivotality approach reigns, then you get bizarre predictions such as that javelin throwers are more likely to have true beliefs about javelin throwing than baseball players have about baseball, because if you're in a baseball team, if you're not pivotal to the outcome, why play very hard? And if you're not going to play very hard, you don't care, why should you know anything about the game? And I would suggest that baseball players know as much about baseball as javelin throwers know about the javelin throw.
Good.
Okay.
I first apologize because I will probably leave before the end of the discussion. I had something planned before the conference was organized. A preliminary statement. When Hélène asked me to make this comment, she added that in order to increase the collective wisdom of the conference, the organizers had to increase its diversity. And it was good to have some typical French political theorist, not somebody who really knows what she's about in American political science, but somebody who doesn't really know, somebody a bit naive, individually less wise, but for the sake of the diversity, much better. I was puzzled. I had some doubts, and as we have seen this morning, Hélène is very optimistic. So part of the night was spent in calculation about the trade-off between less personal knowledge and better collective wisdom. I hope I could do something with more diversity than personal wisdom, say. So, first of all, I'm pretty convinced by your argument on the superiority of the contributory model in respect to the pivotalist model. And I also share your critique of the dichotomy consumer knowledge, voter ignorance. And as an outsider, I have 5 questions. The first one is an epistemic question. It was addressed in a different way 2 decades ago by Pizzorno. Even if we assume that we can objectively measure the voter's knowledge, would you agree to say that it's different with the notion of rationality? Because in my view, any global statement of the political rationality is a political process, a political definition, a political construction. As soon as you consider long-term political interests or the balance of values, what is rational cannot be decided neither by an expert nor by an academic. So that when we discuss about the rationality or the non-rationality of the voters, we have at least to accept that our definition is partly at least a political one. My second question, about what is it discussed when we discuss about voter knowledge? Because voters can know something about substantial issues, but they also can know something, or cannot, about the virtue of the leadership, the capacity to make a good campaign, or the capacity to govern, or the capacity to govern according to what was promised during the campaign. Our voters can also know about the coup or the strategies internal to the political sphere, and these are quite different types of knowledge. And I think it's important to have these differences in mind when we want to discuss about institutions which can, develop voters' knowledge. The third question, don't you think that one should go beyond the dichotomy self-interest, general interest in this discussion. There are some collective interests or values that are neither identical with a general interest nor with a self-interest. Class interest, for example, or the value to defend the rights of migrants. They can be compatible with the general interest or not. They can coincide with some private interest, but it's not always the case. And these values or collective interests are important directly in the discussion, but also because very often they're important in the sense of belonging to one group, be it ideological, social, religious, and probably the voter motivations are strongly correlated with the existence of these collective values or interests. The fourth question, how to make sense of the differences of behavior from one country to the other, but also inside one country from one election to the other. Don't we have to construct not one model of what the voter make, but a variety of ideal types in a Weberian way, and then to combine these ideal types, these various models, in order to explain one particular behavior in one particular moment, in one particular place. Last question. When you look at these huge historical differences, one wonders whether the focus is to be put on individual voters and their rationality, their knowledge, their motivations, or instead, if the major factors couldn't be mechanisms, devices, frames, collective bodies that foster or minimize citizen knowledge and wisdom.
Thanks very much. I find that useful, and I'm not going to do it complete justice. Are there interests intermediate between self-interest and general interests? Yes, there are partial collective interests, and people can believe that those partial collective interests are consistent with the general interest, and other people can dispute that. Are there differences between one country and another? Yes, and let me say that I think there are there is a full variety of motivations and circumstances that influence voter turnout. But I'm focusing on this one central motivation of whether people want to have an effect on the outcome. And then otherwise, just my theoretical approach is very old-fashioned. I think the basic human is, has is a similarity across the 6 million members or 6 billion members of the species on the planet, but face different circumstances, face different sets of constraints, which allows me to offer a general model that is good only in terms of its the scope of its assumptions about its scope and about the motivations, I assume. Now, then you raise the questions of political cognition. Is voters' knowledge different from rationality? And I would say yes, and I'm not in the habit of emphasizing humility, but I'm coming to think that political cognition, although it's been studied over the last 50 years by people far better than me, is that it's still a bit that what you can call low information rationality of making snap decisions on which candidate to vote for based on whether he eats a crepe, eats the ethnic food and appeals to the French, and the low information rationality of choosing a car after watching 7 minutes of advertising, how to relate actual cognition to idealized rational choice models, and complications such as emotions, which have positive effects, not just negative effects, is all increasingly unclear to me, and unfortunately, the more I learn, the less I understand. Is there and I'm not saying that voters know everything. If the argument was here, if I thought I was making an argument for direct democracy, I would quit, because voters know very little. But I'm making the point that consumers know very little, and we have idealized accounts of each domain of knowledge. And in response to your second point, this will be the last thing I say, Elaine, is that Marsilius of Padua embellished on Aristotle's wisdom of the crowds argument. And it's a very interesting few chapters, but the embellishment is, it takes experts to make an argument. You're wondering about the role of experts, and it takes experts to make an argument, but the crowd can judge the argument. So that's my response.
So, Gerry, it seems like you're making the following argument. Again, perhaps you're not. That basically from the pivotal voter model, we get a list of implications. We get the implication that people will not vote. We get the implication that people will be rationally ignorant. And then I get this implication that people will be rationally irrational. And you point out, well, people do vote, which contradicts the assumption, contradicts the prediction of the model. And so we can also stop worrying about the other two predictions of the model. Again, that's how I'm reading you. Now,
very fair.
Yes. Now, again, this argument seems to make a great deal of sense until you start thinking about it in terms of a very simple analogy. So you say, look, if people go to church, surely they're not going to go just to the church that their parents told them to go to and believe whatever they're told and mouth a bunch of dogmas that they've never tested. You might say that, but then you could go and look and see that is what people who go to church generally do. Churches don't generally have a question and answer period. You are not generally welcome if you go and say, look, I'm not so sure about the virgin birth doctrine. Could you explain that a little bit further? And it seems actually when you broaden your understanding of what people's sense of their duty might be, it's very easy to believe that someone might think, look, I have a duty to vote, and then I have a duty to go and promote these dogmas that I've long believed. Right? And that could actually be what they're doing, which would lead them to head over to the voting booth and yet still not actually think very clearly about what they're doing. So that's certainly quite possible, and I guess I'll just leave it there.
So you think that it's possible that people were taught as children that it's instrumentally rational to vote, or they were taught that they have a duty to vote, or both, but they could still be deluded, so the fact of voting is no evidence for my theory.
Not no evidence, but...
Well, that's why I point to Blaise, because people say they want to influence the outcome. And even, what's his name, Hans-Dieter Opp, in his survey of Germans, he's saying, all these people can think they can influence the outcome, but they're deluded because by the pivotalist logic they can't. And I'm suggesting that the German voters may be wiser than Herr Professor Opp. Now, with respect to duty, it's possible that people vote because they've been taught they have a non-consequentialist duty to vote. Whether or not they've been taught that doesn't determine the question whether this is a right duty. And I just don't. And I say we don't know the empirical facts about it, and we have to find out more. And even when people say that we have a duty to go to war if the country is under attack, I don't think we have sufficient investigation of whether people are talking about a non-consequentialist duty or a consequentialist duty. So will plead ignorance, so to speak. Sorry for that way out, but if I have any kind of opinion, I usually try to push it.
What is known about the level of information seeking prior to referenda on specific issues? Having witnessed a few in Norway and France, my impression is that people invest a lot of time learning about the issues, discussing them, debating them. I don't know what's the level of information seeking in California for propositions.
Jon, I don't have professional knowledge of this, but I have personal knowledge. I know nothing about the California propositions because there's so many of them. and so many of them are put up by special interest. But a very interesting, if I may, I'll be quick, and then Brian can answer. And you know this study, a very interesting study by Arthur Lupia, saying a study arguing for the adequacy of low information rationality for voters. Correct me where I'm wrong. Where he looks at voters in California are known to have very little information about the referenda, and there was one on car insurance, and he did like the technique that Brian referred to, where you pick out the well-informed voter and use him or her as a comparison piece, and then he showed that people could act as they could approximate what a highly informed voter would do just by looking at who was for the measure and who was against it. So otherwise, I don't know.
Yeah, it was a little more specific than that. It was actually, did they know that Ralph Nader was the supporter of one initiative and the opponent of the other? Okay. And basically, if you were so ignorant that you didn't even know that, then you didn't vote like an informed person.
You
of your
abstained.
View. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, but on the other hand, if you did know that, then you did mimic the behavior of more informed people of your view.
If I may, there is this school of low information rationality at UC San Diego.
Mm-hmm. Right. Of course, that is, I would say that's an exception to the rule of the enlightened preference literature, which is that you normally do get substantial systematic gaps. But on Professor Elster's question, there's a very good review article on referenda by John Matsuzaka in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and if it doesn't actually answer your fact, then I bet that if you email him, he will know exactly.
One point occurred to me listening to Professor Mackie's interesting paper. There are democracies out there where voting is compulsory. I'm unfortunately not an expert on anything like this, but I believe Australia,
Correct.
Belgium, Greece are countries, very active democracies, of course, where you get fined if you don't vote. And my short question would be, has this improved the democratic process in that country? Does anybody know? Has it impaired the democratic process? Or has it influenced it in one way or another way? A populist way or an inexpert way? Does anybody know? There are no references to that in Professor Mackie's paper, and I can't see one in his bibliography either.
No.
Possibly there is some literature out there amongst the political theory
Yes,
experts.
there is such literature, and I don't have professional knowledge on the question. I did live in Australia for 3 years, and my impression was that Australian government was more responsive, but that's not based on any kind of professional examination. Let me add something that I think is a nice touch. When I said that voters are motivated by the greatest good, that would suggest that they would vote more in elections that they think are more important. And a very nice finding is that in the U.S., people vote more in national elections, where there seems to be more at stake than in state elections. And in Canada, where more functions of the government are delegated to the provincial level, people vote more in provincial elections than they do in federal elections.
So this comment is in response to the
to the first gentleman.
No, to your concern about pivotal causation in voting, and I think
it's
what motivates the entire Downsian worry. But I wonder if it's premised on a wrong view of causation in this case. So if we're all in a firing squad, if there's five of us in a firing squad, and we each fire a bullet, if a bird flies in the way of the first bullet, there's guaranteed to be 4 more bullets that hit. So in a way, the second person in the firing squad, there's a sense in which if they don't cause the death of the condemned, they have a cause that's directly standing behind it.
Yes.
This leads to the idea of an efficacious set,
yes.
in which a set of people, a certain set of people is efficacious to an outcome. Now, the probability of being in an efficacious set during a vote is much, much, much greater than the probability of being the pivotal vote. And if we're really concerned about these instrumentalist justifications for why it is that people vote, maybe people vote because there's a very good probability that they'll be in this efficacious set that's premised on maybe a more accurate reading of causation in the case.
In an electorate of 1 million voters, how many different ways do you pick out 500,001?
You can do a power index on it.
Right, but that's not the issue. The issue is what's the probability of if you were in.
Oh, what's your name?
Jeremy.
Jeremy. I do have fuller argumentation on this issue, and I just skipped over it because it's not essential in my main line of argument. And here's I get into the duplicative causation stuff and Hart and Honoré and Judea Pearl. I understand that, but I think it's too thin a read for my argument. I do bother to make the point in the full presentation, but I think it's too thin a read of argument because I learned from one person, if pivotality is the consideration, then I want to elect not only the pivotal member of the House of Representatives, but also the pivotal senator, and also be pivotal in selecting the president, and I want to be pivotal in making all three agree on policy, which means that you would be smarter to do anything except vote, or there'd be no, that's just too implausible. And then secondly, Jeremy, under that construction, I think it accounts for, overvoting, but not undervoting. But we observe that people, we would still have the problem that no one certainly expecting to be in the minority would have a reason to vote. And yet we do see people expecting or certain of being in the minority voting, which I argue is more consistent with taking into consideration the mandate value. I mean the mandate value of voting.
Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you.